Greetings all. My name is Angeline Stevens. I'm from the Sexuality and Gender Division of SAPS. It is my absolute pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to you all. We have quite a high number of participants and the number is climbing. And I think that this is indicative of just how important this topic is. So we're really, really happy to see you all. This evening, we are hoping to have quite an engaging evening. Obviously, with August being Women's Month, this webinar entitled Domestic Violence Amendment Act 2021, Is It Enough? And What Are Its Implications for Psychological Practice? Is a webinar that's hosted by SAPS and the Sexuality and Gender Division. And obviously in August, there's a lot of focus on violence against women. And we thought we would, given that the Domestic Violence Act has been amended, we thought we would look more critically at what do these amendments actually mean on a practical level in terms of practice, specifically mental health practitioners, but not limited to mental health practitioners. We know that when we talk about violence generally, and specifically in terms of violence against women and other groups, it doesn't just involve one stakeholder. So community partners, individuals, what are the implications for those different groups, and how do we fit in as well? In 1998, when the Domestic Violence Act came into effect, the idea was that of protection and access to services. So whenever legislation is amended and revised, the idea is that it is going to add something more. It's going to enhance some aspect as well. So we have been very privileged to have a really lovely panel with us this evening. We've got Lisa Vetten, we've got Kateko Ndlala Magero with us, and we've got Nkaniso Madlala. Our panelists are going to offer us a range of perspectives, and I will introduce each one of them before they present. Each presenter, we will go through all the presentations first. And at the end of the three presentations, we're going to open up the space for dialogue. We really want to be looking critically at the revisions, and not just in terms of the Domestic Violence Act, but also what's termed as the DVAA, right? So it's meant to work in tandem with the Criminal and Related Matters Amendment Act and the Criminal Law Amendment Act as well. Now, we know as psychologists and mental health practitioners, there are a lot of ethical guidelines and in terms of that guide our own practice. How do these laws actually then filter into our practice in terms of, we think about an ethics of care, all right, versus how in terms of agency for our clients or the people that we work with, and how far are we able to go as well in terms of offering support to persons that we work with. So we're hoping that we can really make it quite a practical webinar. We hope that you'll be looking forward to hearing your own thoughts on this very important topic. So with that, I would like to begin by introducing our first presenter. It's Lisa Vetten. Now, Lisa has worked extensively in the area of violence, and particularly violence against women. I'm going to assume that you all have read Lisa's bio sketch, but I'd like to just pick up a few points from there, particularly in relation to this webinar. So Lisa was involved in the drafting of the first DVV, so the Domestic Violence Act in 1998. So we're really very privileged to have her here as well. She's also offered commentary on the revised Act. Lisa has contributed to the drafting of the Domestic Violence Act and commented on its recent amendments. She has researched the Act's implementation by the police and courts and is currently part of a project examining the health sector's role in addressing domestic violence. And this includes a specific focus on mental health. And Lisa has also been working extensively over the years. She's been part of the Commission of Gender Equality as well, as a specialist on violence against women. And she's been engaged in quite extensive study over the years as well in this area. So with that in mind, what we've asked Lisa is to draw on her experience, to draw on her work, and to draw on her current studies as well, and to share with us what her thoughts are on what the intentions of the laws are and how effective are they, or they're likely to be. We've also asked Lisa to draw on her work as part of the group that is driving the design of the assessment form that can be rolled out in healthcare settings. And we've asked Lisa, in her view, what are the implications of the amended Domestic Violence Act and how it would work and its implications for assessment and the reporting obligations for the work of psychologists in particular, but also other stakeholders and role players. So with those brief introduction, it's my pleasure, Lisa, to ask you to please begin, and over to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Angeline. I'm going to just quickly share my presentation. Most of what I'm going to focus on is really, I think, looking at the implications of the Act for psychologists. And here I'm really going to be drawing on some of the work I've been doing since about 2018 with shelters, and focusing in particular on the struggles that they have faced in relation to addressing the mental health needs of their beneficiaries. So that's what a lot of what I'm going to focus on. I'm not going to give you a crash course in the Domestic Violence Act, since I'm sure most of you don't want to become lawyers. But I'll just give a very brief sketch of it before going into the new aspects which have particular implications for you. So then, just to begin, when we're talking about the domestic and domestic violence, we're talking about intimate partner violence, irrespective of sexual orientation or gender identity. We're talking about child abuse, we're talking about elder abuse, and we're talking about abuse between family members. I'm going to be focusing on intimate partner violence without in any way suggesting that the other three forms of abuse are irrelevant. And if anything, particularly I think for elder abuse and abuse between family members, they are very understudied. We have, in particular, one sees older women and family members arriving at domestic violence shelters, having experienced abuse. They can make up to a quarter of residents, but they're a group that attracts very little attention, I think, in terms of both public discourse, services, and I think broader attention to the problem of domestic violence. So when we're talking domestic violence, we're talking broadly. But as I said, I'm going to rather be specifically focusing on intimate partner violence. One of the new, and I think most interesting aspects of the amendments is the recognition, finally, that domestic violence is not just a problem for the police and the courts, that it requires a very much broader response. So what the Act has done is put a range of obligations on different stakeholders, one of whom is health, to also start providing a response in relation to domestic violence. This is really important. So, and at this little time, I just give a sense of how long it's taken for the recognition to be made real, that there are serious health consequences to domestic violence. So in 1998, there was a duty placed on SAPS to help complainants access medical care without being at all clear what it meant. I'm sorry, you'll just have to excuse me wheezing a bit. In 2001, the primary healthcare package for South Africa, a set of norms and standards was put in place. It has never really been followed, especially specifically the sections dealing with domestic violence. Where another possibility emerged was in 2007, when you had the promulgation of the Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Act, which designated post-exposure prophylaxis or clinical forensic medicine sites. Why I'm highlighting those is that they have started to now, it's now being recognized that domestic violence should also receive specialized attention. And it's one of the oddities of our system that there has been a great deal of emphasis on rape in the healthcare sector and very little on domestic violence. To the extent that while the police take women or children to centres to be examined, complete the rape kits, you have specialized centres like the Tutuzela care centres. More often than not, if not all, in most of the vast majority of cases, the police do nothing more than give women a J88 and tell them to go and find their way to a police station and bring the form back when they're done. Only occasionally will they take women to health facilities. So those centres have been underutilized. And I think it's partly that reflects the somewhat inferior status of domestic violence in some senses. General ethical guidelines for reproductive health were put out by the Health Professionals Council in 2016. And then in 2021, the DVAA was amended and a duty placed on health workers to respond to domestic violence. So it's taken a very long time to get to this point. Very briefly, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but the Act has now expanded the definition of domestic violence. It's now included sexual harassment and related person abuse, referring to the fact that threatening to harm a member of your family who you care about is abusive, and the protection can be obtained for that. It's also now added elder abuse, just by linking that to the Older Persons Act. It's distinguished between coercive behavior and controlling behavior, and it's also added a new definition in terms of exposing a child to domestic violence. And that exposing of a child is important in terms of what it's in terms of the duties that have been now placed on health workers. So if we look at the amendment, Section 2 is to provide assistance to complainants, including by helping them obtain medical treatment. And Section 2A introduces a new category of person, a functionary, who must report a belief or suspicion to SAPS or a social worker that a child, a person with disability, or older person may be experiencing domestic violence. And they must also conduct a risk assessment and refer for further services. And then Section 18B requires the Director General of Health to develop directives guiding how the risk assessment is to be conducted, services to be provided to the complainants, and public education communication initiatives around the roles of functionaries. This is where the Department of Health has failed dismally. So the Act came into effect in April of this year. A number of letters to the department have yet to even receive a response or receipt of acknowledgement around how far the Department of Health is in developing those directives. And also, although there is now the form which can be used to report the belief or suspicion has been developed, that risk assessment doesn't seem to exist. So it's at this point, things are very, I think the courts and the police, perhaps because they have a history of implementing the Act, are relatively organized and know what is required of them. But the health sector has really just lagged well behind. And I think that is an unfortunate repetition of its not being their problem for well over 2 decades. It's going to be a real struggle to accept and take it on now. I think also within the context where the health sector is very overloaded, my sense is they probably don't want to take on any further responsibilities, and that may also be contributing to the foot dragging. So at this point, we have a big gap regarding what is required of the health sector. Because in terms of the definition of a functionary, and I mean this does apply to you, is you are classified as functionaries. In terms of the various health acts, you fall within the department. You are a health worker, and so you would be required to report this belief or suspicion. So I think until the Department of Health gets better involved, you're in a difficult position, and I do think there's a need to conduct much greater advocacy to get the Department of Health to start working on this, and to not just slap something together very quickly in the desire to meet a legal provision, but to do so with proper consultation with all the various people who do work in the health sector to make sure that this is a meaningful addition to the law. It's not just ticking a box because the law says you have to, and opting for the least that you can possibly do and get away with in order to meet your obligations. So I'd like to go into a little bit more detail around what I think could be some of the roles that psychologists in particular could be playing in relation to the Act. And these have been much needed roles that have been required for many years now. And they're most acute, I think, at the level of shelters. So just very briefly, just have a look at some of the data around intimate partner violence and mental health. And most of what I'm providing with you is fairly dated, but we don't seem to have any good recent studies. So what we do know from the SAPS survey, which is now well over a decade old, is that domestic violence is responsible for the greatest number of PTSD cases at population level. That was relatively low, the rates they provided, which may have to do with the kind of tools that were being used. And so higher rates have been picked up by a study undertaken in Gauteng in 2010, which puts PTSD at over 1 in 4 of the women who were raped by their non-partners, and 15% by women who were either sexually or physically abused by their partners. Also reported depressive symptoms, suicide attempts, and suicidal ideation in just over a third of women reporting sexual or physical IPV, so 1 in 3. Other studies also drawing from SASH data suggest that abused women are nearly twice as likely to report ever drinking, and 2.4 times more likely to report the regular drinking and non-medical use of sedatives than non-abused women. And the lifetime and past year non-medical use of painkillers is almost double for abused women. So you can see a certain amount of self-medication happening, which may well have to do with the absence of other support. If we look at women's shelters and mental health, the data I'm presenting here are far from precise. They're taken from shelters' intake records who, while they have social workers, are not necessarily in a position to be diagnosing and assessing women. And because they have a significant struggle with linking with psychiatric facilities, outpatients, and clinics around mental health, really do struggle. So I think what I'm presenting here is going to be an undercount. So if we look at 23 shelters case files, this would have represented well over 600 women. And I think what we're seeing here are women who would have been on the more serious spectrum of difficulty. So, and I think the variation will obviously also reflect the ability of shelter workers to pick up problems. So between 20% to 32% of women were diagnosed with disorders that included schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar disorder, and borderline personality disorder, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. So serious and difficult complications. Shelter staff have also referred to anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation or attempts, as well as difficulties with substance abuse. So the figures I've presented today are crudely estimated, but they do suggest a higher level of psychological distress amongst abused women. The 12-month prevalence for any disorder, and that's again drawing on the SASH data, was 16.5%. And I think what tends to aggravate women's difficulties is a fair portion of women are in the perinatal period. They're young, they have small children under the age of 5. 16% have completed high school and have a matric certificate, so the vast majority don't have that degree, that extent of education. And why that's important is what it means for their employability. So not unsurprisingly, 2/3, so some 66% of women on average had no source of income. They were living on child support grants. So you're looking at a group of women who have unemployed, serious economic difficulties, compounded by small children and other difficulties, often a lack of family support, and a great deal of difficulty. A fair amount of HIV as well, which also I think can add to women's difficulties. So a group of women who perhaps would be struggling more than other abused women. I think one also saw that in some instances, shelters were actually functioning as a kind of short-stay community health facility. And one saw, although women were coming in for domestic violence, there were also another smaller group of women who were coming in because they'd been found wandering, because they were living on the streets, they'd been abandoned by their partners, they'd lost employment, and this had quite often triggered triggered serious psychological difficulties. Doesn't seem like anyone could have taken them into a hospital. And the same with some women who came in for intimate partner violence. What looked like happening, if you tracked their record, is that they had simply become part of the revolving door that circulated individuals between mental health facilities and other institutions. And there is an observation by shelters that post-COVID, the mental health difficulties being faced or experienced by women they're admitting seem to be much higher than they were prior to COVID. And they also have a sense, in some instances, that what may be happening is that someone may not necessarily be being abused, but their families cannot deal with their psychological difficulties and are approaching the shelter saying there is abuse because they are not managing with the woman and are looking for the shelter to take over that management. I think the difficulty of that is that shelters are not equipped to be able to provide specialized, intensive, supportive care. Just to give you some examples of the kinds of cases that one saw, this was Christine. She'd been sexually abused by her father for a number of years with her mother's complicity. She left Western Cape and came to Eastern Cape where nobody knew her. She first stayed at one shelter, and then when she left, she went to a second shelter. And then she left and tried to work and get on with her life, but then returned again some 2 years later. By then, she'd been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and PTSD. She'd also had a couple of spells in psychiatric wards following her attempt at suicide, and she now required specialized psychiatric assistance and monitoring. The shelter attempted to admit her to one of the hospitals, but was discouraged from doing so on the grounds that psychotic patients in the ward were not above, this was according to the doctor, they weren't above trying to have sex with other patients. And whether they meant rape or sex, who knows? But it was very clear that for somebody like Christine, that's a very high-risk scenario to be in, given her particular history. It's a very high-risk scenario for anybody. So Christine is one example. Another example was Sina, who had been trafficked between two provinces and forced into drug taking. She subsequently escaped and returned home, where she was referred to shelter for her safety. After her escape, she'd been hospitalized 3 times, following a suicide attempt on each occasion. She was also experiencing auditory hallucinations and observed to argue with herself at times. The medication she'd been given made it difficult for her to hold down a job, and so the shelter assisted her to obtain a disability grant. So I think the particular so these are very serious difficulties. What shelters grapple with is that they do need to use the public health system. In many instances, the wait is up to 4 months for a psychiatrist. They're left in the position of how do you help somebody who is in this kind of condition? It's often very difficult to have somebody in a shelter who's not managing with other residents, because it tends to spark conflict and other difficulties amongst shelter residents. You can have incidents where somebody may have a breakdown and assault shelter staff or other women in the shelter. So it's a scenario where I think shelters have been left to really struggle and are either refusing to take women at all who have any kind of history of psychiatric difficulty, which, because they don't feel equipped to support them, and keeping them in the shelter may be too difficult for other residents. But it leaves a very real question of what happens to this group of women. Where do they go? Because they're not safe at home. Sometimes they're not wanted at home. Psychiatric wards don't seem to be able to take them. I mean, one of the other difficulties raised by the shelter is that even getting women into an observation unit at a hospital is incredibly difficult due to the lack of access. So they're just looking at the National Mental Health and Policy Framework and Strategic Plan for 2013-2020. I'm not aware of a more recent one. I'd be very happy if you told me that there is a recent one. But that then was looking at the mental health human resources available to the Department of Health, which is where shelters will be turning to. So you have human health resources of 9.3 per 100,000, which disaggregated amounts to 0.28 psychiatrists per 100,000, 0.45 other medical doctors not specialized in psychiatry, 7.4 nurses, slightly more psychologists and psychiatrists, 0.32, 0.4 social workers, 0.13 occupational therapists, and 0.2.8 other mental health or mental health workers per 100,000 population. The situation at that point was even worse. Once you moved into rural areas, psychiatrists there were, you had 0.03 per 100,000 of the population in the country's public sector rural health settings. So mental health there, one imagines, is probably even worse in the sense that it's not attended to as it needs to be. And at the time this data was collected, in Mpumalanga, the Eastern, Western, and Northern Cape were reported to employ no full-time psychiatrists in rural public sector health settings. I hope that data is old. So I think to conclude, how can psychologists become more engaged with the work of shelters? And that's the question I want to throw open to you. Very few have access to psychologists. Some psychologists may offer some voluntary work, but the vast majority have no access at all. What is interesting is in the Eastern Cape, the Department of Social Development did sometimes pay for shelters to be able to organize sessions with a mental health worker, but that is an exception rather than a rule. Part of the problem and difficulty, I think, in accessing psychological services is that funding for shelters comes through the Department of Social Development. The Department of Social Development employs social workers. Psychologists fall under the Department of Health. So their feeling is that it's the Department of Health who must fund. And as you can see with the Department of Health, that has yet to get around to looking at directives. That simply hasn't happened. So I think it's why we remain at the question is how can you become more engaged with the work of shelters? So I'm going to end there.
Lisa, thank you very much for sharing your insights and experiences with your work at the shelters. And I think it just foregrounds just how severe the mental health impact and effects of violence against women in particular is. And I think especially in terms of the role of psychologists, it raises really important questions, which I'm hoping we're going to be able to engage with as well. Because, you presented not just in terms of the mental health effects, but also in terms of its intersections with just very serious socioeconomic challenges as well. And how do we then work with context, communities, individuals, and the work of mental health practitioners as well. So thank you so much for that. We're going to move now to our next presenter, and it is my pleasure here to welcome and introduce to you Nkateko Nadladla Magoro. Nkateko is a registered counseling psychologist, and she is the CEO of Well Life Inc., which trades as Pretoria Psychologists. She collaborate with SADC with a series of information on YouTube and advocacy. Nkateko's interests include premarital relationship and marriage counseling, parental guidance, HIV/AIDS counseling, information and management of families living with HIV/AIDS, bereavement, effects of childhood and adult sexual and physical abuse, trauma work, and family home-related stress and anxiety disorders. So with that in mind, what we asked Nkateko to share with us this evening is, based on her work with domestic violence survivors, to what extent could the revised act improve the support provided to women and other vulnerable groups and persons who have experienced violence? What is the likely impact that this act is going to have in their lives, and what, in her view, are the implications of the act and the new assessment and reporting obligations for the work of psychologists. And finally, are there any cultural and religious considerations which should be taken into account when working with domestic violence and violence generally? And as we listen to and Kiteko, I think Lisa's also provided quite a nice overarching framework in terms of what are some of the context, in terms of the context that persons who are experience violence have to go through. So, and embedded in that are the cultural factors, are the economic factors. So, and I know they've included, there was some debate about the spiritual side of abuse as well. So we will look forward, and Kateko, to hearing your presentation and you sharing your views with us. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Angeline, for the introduction, and also Lisa for taking us through the first segment of the presentation. I have started presenting. I'm not sure if you can see it on your side or if it's still loading. My internet is not so stable, so there's very low bandwidth on my side, but I'm hoping you can see everything for now. If you can confirm that you can see everything, I think that also will be helpful.
So Takeko, it's saying that you've started sharing, but we're still waiting to see the actual screen. Ah, there we go. Thank you. It's all good, hey? So we can see your screen.
All right. The sound is staggering, but I think I can hear the confirmation that you can see my screen. And then I will continue from there. So I'm not going to go into the details because Lisa did take us through that in terms of you know, the history and the changes that are there in the legislation, but maybe just to also point out that the GBV Amendment Act is really to make the fight against gender-based violence more effective. So that is the aim of the Act, and also provide survivors with more support and protection. And again, as I will reiterate, as Lisa has already mentioned. But I would like to maybe highlight the particular changes that I also found quite interesting, and they were also included in Lisa's presentation, but maybe for also our discussion and also to just have a little bit of focus on that. So the addition of definition for several types of domestic abuse, and I will speak to that in terms of what I think it does in for the psyche of a person to know that their form of abuse is acknowledged and it's noted, and it's also in the policy. The procedural issues, this speaks to our obligation to report, and maybe to even highlight that it means when this is the case, there is no such a person as a bystander. We are all, we do all have obligation to then report and, you know, more so in terms of us as healthcare workers, but also it says that nobody is immune to reporting domestic violence. There are also revision of some pre-existing definitions, because some of the definitions were not inclusive to other instances and incidents. So that also, as I talking through this, is to just highlight. And then the technical issues, and I think Lisa also highlighted this, but I also want to make it, to highlight and say that the 24-hour service of being able to report, I'm not sure, I think colleagues, you can help me, but I've tried to look at the portal and also the electronic submission in terms of the efficacy. I've not seen that. I know that there was news and all of that to say that there is that excitement that a person who is reporting on behalf of somebody who's suffering gender-based violence, or even a victim themselves, they do have access to report 24 hours. So the notable changes that I am speaking up to, so the mandatory reporting obligation of functionaries, as Lisa has mentioned, that although this is also obliging us as mental health workers or healthcare workers in general, there has not been a response from the Department of Health in terms of how do we then, especially as when it comes to the conducting of risk assessment, so that we can refer for other services. And then this one I've already highlighted. And I'm highlighting point number 4, or bullet number 4, the annual training on the DVAA and its regulations. So this speaks to people who are working directly with victims of domestic violence. And I think we also need to be mindful in terms of the support that we might need to also give, especially in terms of training, not so much as with the legislation, but also debriefing, trauma, because these are people who are on a day-to-day basis, could also have the, be traumatized by the events that they are dealing with on a daily basis. And then, so improved support posed by the, the Domestic Violence Amendment Act. I think when something is in legislation, it is quite empowering. It gives somebody, it gives an individual a voice to say that I am not thinking this, I'm not making this up. I'm real in what I'm thinking. I'm real in what I'm feeling in terms of the harm that I am encountering or that I'm experiencing. So I think having put it in paper, it's quite empowering in itself, because I think it's also affirming in a way. So I see this as very positive, to have broadened the scope and to also have the revisions that we are discussing today. On the other hand, I believe that it dismantles stigma in that, when something is legalized or it's legislation, more people are able to speak out versus keeping in. And it also depends on what are we going to do with the information that is at hand. How do we then educate and, just be able to let people know that it is okay to report. They are not thinking, their experiences are valid. And then access as well. But this we can debate later on, maybe when we have our discussion. And what that speaks to is the 24-hour reporting, or, getting a protection order via email or via the 24-hour portal. So you can imagine somebody experiencing domestic violence at the wee hours of the morning, 3 a.m., and having to wait until they can approach the court. So I think this is very, very empowering and quite progressive to say that there can be that platform and the allowance for somebody to then report 24 hours. And I want to also extend it to say the legislation also speaks to the fact that it gives permission for any other person who is experiencing, who is within the vicinity, be it a family member who's living in the same household, to also report on behalf of the victim. And then I think also it very much contributes to the advocacy role that we already have established as psychologists, but also to have a bigger voice to say, but this is what legislation is saying. What are we doing about this? And I think that's also related to the question that Lisa has posed to us. The legislation also speaks of support and it speaks of monitoring. So where there's a case or there's a protection order that is laid or that is issued, where then the law enforcers are able to, or what the legislation also call I'm forgetting the words, but I think it's got something to do with peace, not peace soldiers, but to go and monitor the situation. So they've got permission to do that. And I think that also shows great support. Yes, we might speak about capacity and we can debate on that, but already it heightens and conscientizes the police force to say, we don't just issue a protection order, but we also go and do follow-ups to see what is happening. And also the legislation supports the fact that the law enforcers can forcefully go into the premises where there is no access and be able to monitor on a regular basis. And then also healing, so the proposed Amendment Act or Amended Act speaks to offering spaces of healing. And Lisa mentioned the fact that the shelters are funded by social development, and I happened to know the command center, the Gender-Based Command Center, and people who manage that. And it's just that my notes are not showing in the slide. I was hoping that I could see my notes as I present, but it means you will also see them on that side, because I want what I know is that in the the command center, there is 24 hours. It's a helpline, it's a telephonic helpline, and there's always at least a minimum of 8 to 12 social workers who are manning the call center with cases of GBV. So I think that is very, very positive in terms of that support. But as Lisa has already highlighted, there are many other places that are still reluctant to then shelter and even admit, especially in psychiatric units and clinics, victims of domestic violence because of what they perceive as the risk that the individuals pose. But I think I would say it's quite empowering to know that there's legislation that is looking at support and also the healing or even rehabilitation of the victims. I'm just going to highlight the impact of the Amendment Act on the victims. I'm going to highlight student population and children. Yes, I know that there is array of vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, such as the LGBTQI plus community, but I want to highlight this, and I've been having conversation with a number of colleagues as far as this is concerned, and these are colleagues that are working in student support, these are colleagues who are working with young people. And for them, they welcomed the ability for any other adult to report incidents of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Reasons being, even though a student is an 18-year-old and above, so is a major, and the law before had allowed for the person to have their own independence in terms of reporting or not. But I think the student population, and even this morning I was speaking to a group of students at TUT in terms of the position that they find themselves in as far as poverty is concerned, as far as the power play is concerned. And I like also what one of my colleagues shared with me in the series of workshops and seminars that they've been embarking on, or going to, in discussion of what are the different policies that the different campuses have put in place to safeguard students. And if I stand under correction, but she highlighted that VETS has got it in their policy that a lecturer or a staff member needs to disclose a relationship with a student, and that disclosure is renewable every year. So if the relationship is ongoing, the next year and the other year and the other year, every time, just like a license, you need to disclose that I'm in a relationship with a student, which I thought that was very powerful in terms of policy and implementation and recognizing the vulnerability of students. And as I mentioned, even though they are majors, but also the position that they find themselves in. The phenomenon of sugar daddies, or even now rising phenomenon of sugar mummies, we realize that then we cannot put students in the same power dynamic in terms of how it impacts and also the ability to report. I also want to highlight on children, the Domestic Violence Amended Act highlights or speaks to the fact that when a child is in a violent or aggressive environment, we also need to report, or the child also has got the right to report. But oftentimes children find themselves quite helpless. And I've got case study after case study. And one such case study was a client that I saw yesterday, and she was saying that she wants me to see the kids because the father has been very, very aggressive, very rude, emotionally, verbally, and now it has come to physical. But she says, you know what, I can manage his anger because he's my spouse, and I also know how to deal with this because I'm an adult. But my children, on the other hand, behaviorally, their behavior has changed. They are also aggressive. They talk back to their father. And obviously in therapy, I tried to show her that, an apple does not really fall far from a tree, but not in a judgmental way, but to try to show her that the environment that she is raising her children is actually the one that is promoting the behavior. And she was feeling like they are ill-disciplined. And I, as I said, I tried to then highlight, and she had actually made an appointment for these kids, for me to see the kids. And when I checked the calendar, I saw that the kids were already there for the next week. And I said to her, if your husband is agreeing to come to therapy, please come with her. And I also put a disclaimer and said, it could be that at the end of this, I might not even see your children. I might only see you. And that's only if your husband is willing to be rehabilitated, because if he's not willing to be rehabilitated, you are going to be in the same situation. So, children find themselves at the receiving end, and I'm grateful that the act is empowering children. It's empowering us as healthcare providers and mental health care providers to be able to do something and to intervene where we see such a risk. The other child that I also saw, a teenager, she felt quite angry at the situation that she was made or forced to be in, because she felt that she does not have a choice but to live in a household that is traumatic, where there is violence, and where the father also treat her with no respect and no regard because she is a child. And when I spoke to the mother said, well, I do not have any choice but to stay with this man because of all the what he provides and the societal pressures and all of that. So as I'm saying, I'm just highlighting these two vulnerable groups. And as much as students are majors, and I mean the amended act also provides and makes provision for us to include across the board in terms of reporting. It does not only talk to minors, it also speaks to major, as long as we deem them to be vulnerable in the situation. Practicality, and I think this will be very much open to debate. The human resource, the sheer amount of, the reported cases, how practical is it for us in terms of our own obligation to report and also assess. And, as far as when somebody is not even ready, you might report on their behalf or assess them to be at risk, but then they are not ready to take that step. They are still not there. Maybe they are in a codependent relationship. They're depending on the person that is violating them, abusing them, or they are saying in inverted commas, they are staying for the kids. So that obligation, I'm wondering, and maybe this is also a question to all of us colleagues to say, how much of an obligation can we take on as much as we are obligated to report? And also, when it comes to advocacy, maybe part of our obligation, if reporting fails, is to advocate very strongly and to be a strong voice, because we know that as far as somebody who is staying in an abusive relationship or somebody who is in an environment where there's abuse and it's normalized, they also somehow normalizes that and might not even see a, I'm not necessarily gonna say a problem as such, but they could feel like there is no other choice other than staying in this relationship. So I think that obligation, maybe we can also, when reporting is not so practical because maybe the person is not cooperative in you trying to report and intervene on their behalf, but the advocacy role that we can play. And I think we can then have a stronger voice when it comes to that. Then looking at cultural and religious consideration, the societal norms. We still live in a very patriarchal society. As much as, the population, it's more female than male, it's still a male-dominant society. When I was speaking to the group of students this morning, the other one raised their hand and said, but how is the Gender-Based Violence Amended Act considering men? And when I looked at it, because this is also the societal norm where men report these incidents, they are not taken seriously. They can be secondarily victimized. They could be mocked by their own families and their own friends and the environment that they find themselves in. So it's still very much up to us as we advocate and speak up to say, yes, this might look like it's normal, but it is not normal. I was saying to somebody who's very, very close to me, they wanted to tell me why the spouse or the partner has lashed on the other person. And I said to them, you stop it right there, because there is no way you can make any reason or defend somebody being violent and being abusive. Why doesn't that person walk away? So it's in those spaces, our intimate spaces, where we can make a difference, one person at a time, one community at a time, one setting at a time, one church at a time. The judicial system, is it open enough to say, when we come with a person has been stalking me, and I see this as abuse, or they are controlling me, they control which friends I should be with, what should I dress, they control how I should think, and is this, again, yes, the act is there, but in terms of the societal norms, are we then putting this as a very, very serious infringement, I'm actually not getting the word that I want to use here. An offense, yes, that's the word that I want to use. So until this permeates into society, and as I said, we are in that role to advocate. The same with the law enforcement and its own capacity. And I've already spoken about the secondary victimization of saying, but what were you wearing, or what were you doing on the street, or you say your wife hit you, why didn't you hit her back? So we find this also, this kind of norms in the law enforcement and the police services, which are supposed to be protecting the very same people. Religious, in my own experience and my own exposure, I think there is great male protectionism in religious context. And I think this is also fed by the patriarchy that exists in religious context, because those institutions, or the institutions of religion, is very much patriarchal. And when a person is not, things like women's bodies being policed so much, that is normalized within the religious environment, where women need to dress a particular way, and when you are not dressing a particular way, you are not holy enough, or you are not devoted enough, you are not religious enough. But there is nothing that is said to our male counterparts in terms of how they should dress and how they should conduct themselves in spaces where then women would be told how to conduct themselves. If they are too loud, they are seen as being forward, and almost like seen as looking for it. And there's one powerful picture that I now and then like putting on my status, of a woman with legs wide open and naked with legs wide open, with a placard saying, "I'm not looking for it." And I remember somebody from the church that I used to go to making a comment to say that is vulgar. But I think that was speaking to a person. It was, and I think that kind of offense, I like doing that so that people start to think, and they get shocked, and we have this discussion, and we have the conversations around what does that mean, because even somebody in fully clothed, they can still be violated sexually. Even somebody providing economically, they can still be abused economically by the same person that they are providing for. So I think I will leave it here in terms of just my thoughts and my reflections of the changes and what I think can be considered in terms of our own mandate, or even the space that we find ourselves in, especially in being advocates, and also looking out into what are some of the ways that we can creatively think about implementing the amended act in a maybe slimly resourced environment.
And Nteko, thank you so much for sharing with us your experiences and your work. I think you've highlighted so many important points, especially what happens on the ground in terms of mental health work. And I like that you have highlighted just how it can be very affirming, when through legislation, when it acknowledges that violence does happen. But I think through sharing some of your case studies, you've also highlighted how we have this progressive legislation. And this is a point that has been made repeatedly, but we really fail dismally in terms of its implementation. And I think you've also highlighted how, in terms of when you look at families and systems and communities, it's so nuanced, it's so complex that it's not just a simple case of saying, okay, you have an obligation to report, because the question next is, what next? What then? And there could be a counter argument then in terms of to what extent is a person who's already vulnerable, perhaps the vulnerability is increased. Do we expose the person to further harm if there isn't adequate protection? So you've raised some really important points in terms of just those intersections of structural, cultural, social factors that also impact in terms of how the kinds of support and also the limitations of support that a mental health practitioner can offer. And I see we've already started getting some questions and comments, so please invite you all to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We are going to open the space soon for some dialogue, but please do feel free to put in your questions as you listen to our presenters. So we've had, and thank you also for sharing some of your work with children and students. Again, groups that I think are exposed to a lot of violence overall, and often the sense of helplessness and not being able to report, or for there to be enough and adequate support. And with that, I would like to then introduce our third presenter for this evening. Nkanyisa Madladla is a clinical psychologist at the Department of Correctional Services. He has received several accolades in the past as a student and as an academic. He is also an executive member of the Sexuality and Gender Division at SAISA and the LGBTQIA+ Human Rights Project. He's a member of the core committee that is reviewing the Psychological Procedure Manual for the Department of Correctional Services. Nkanyisa is currently a PhD candidate at UNISA, and his research focuses on sexuality and gender diversity, specifically in the carceral population. So with that background, what we asked Nkanyisa was to look at again to what extent could the revised and amended Act improve the support provided to women and other vulnerable, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong brief. For Nkanyisa, we decided to then look at vulnerable groups. We know that in the amended Act, we have provision made for the elderly, for children, for people, persons with disabilities, vulnerable populations, such as those that have intellectual and cognitive impairments. And we thought we're going to finish our presentations this evening with a focus on sexual and gender minorities here. So with that, we've asked Nkanyisa to look at violence within same-sex relationships. These are often underreported for a range of reasons, such as feelings of shame and guilt, victimization, and secondary trauma when reporting, lack of effective social and legal support systems, power dynamics within relationships, and internalized homophobia in some instances. So one of the aims of the DVAA is to enhance reporting of violence that is perpetrated within domestic spaces and intimate relationships. And Nkateko has already highlighted just how complex it is when you work with families. What we've invited Nkanyisa to do is to look at what is the likely impact, if any, of the DVAA on reporting and perpetration of violence in same-sex and queer relationships. So with that, Nkanyisa, over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Angeline. I hope everyone can hear me or see my slide.
So Nkanyisa, I think so you need to open your presentation first and then share. We can view your screen, but it's just showing us your all your lists of documents.
Oh, I have opened it. Let's see.
So I think stop share. Keep this on and then come back.
Okay. A bit technologically okay, can people see my screen now?
Super, we can. Thank you, Nkanyisa.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you very much, Angeline, for inviting me to share today. I just need to go back a little bit. I think this is a wonderful platform. And, you know, as I was listening to the presentations, I was kind of reflecting on what has been happening this month and, you know, thinking about what is happening today. We are creating more and more platforms where we are speaking about intimate partner violence, we're speaking about gender-based violence. And yesterday I was actually invited by one of the local radio stations in Boksburg to also speak about this topic. So I think, you know, we are seeing a lot of spaces being opened up and a lot of people showing interest and a lot of people wanting to know and to listen and, you know, to get information and knowledge around this area. So the focus of my presentation, you know, listening to the other presentations, I feel like, you know, my two colleagues have spoken about everything I was going to speak about. So I'm just going to present, you know, and summarize a few important things. I'm just going to take a very long time, hopefully. But the focus of my presentation is going to be on looking at how IPV has been defined. Obviously, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one. We're going to look at the prevalence of IPV, particularly in same-sex or queer relationships. We'll look at the silence around violence. What are the barriers to reporting? Again, focusing on same-sex relationships. Briefly, what are the health and mental health consequences of IPV, which have been touched on already. The role of the DVAA in promoting reporting. Is there a role that it can actively play for this community, and definitely what are the possible interventions that you can all employ. So the World Health Organization looks at IPV as any behavior between two individuals, two or more individuals, that involves the acts of physical, sexual violence, emotional and psychological abuse and controlling behavior. And if you look at the Domestic Violence Amendment Act, obviously it has expanded the list of behaviors and practices that can now be categorized as domestic abuse. Again, a pattern of behavior in which physical and emotional coercion of violence is then used to gain power. And I think what we see more, I mean, in literature and in practice, more and more people become locked in these destructive, violent relationships, largely because of the power differences. If you're looking at Nkateko's presentation, looking at the students and the children, and sometimes partners who are not employed and they are financially dependent on their partners, the power dynamic comes into play and prevents people from exiting this kind of relationships. Now, if you're looking at research and interventions on IPV, And historically, they've been more focused on heterosexual women. And we can, sort of like attribute this to the marginalization of same-sex identities, the marginalization of LGBTQI identities. We know that in some of the African countries, these identities are still criminalized. If you're thinking about Nigeria, thinking about Cameroon, we think about Uganda, for an example, that has been in the news lately. So these behaviors are marginalized and they're criminalized. And because of that positioning, there hasn't been much research, and there haven't been any intervention that have been done in terms of addressing IPV in same-sex relationships. Now, what is the prevalence? We can also look at the comparison between same-sex relationships as well as heterosexual relationships. And research has shown us, and it illustrates specifically that men who have sex with men experience IPV at rates that are substantially higher than those experienced by men who don't have sex with men, or for those who identify as heterosexual, and rates that are comparable or higher to those among heterosexual women. The lifetime prevalence of IPV in LGBT couples has been documented as being similar or higher than in heterosexual ones. For example, the breakdown in figures. Of course, these figures are more international figures. They are figures that are coming from research done in global north countries. So, for example, 61.1% of bisexual men, 43% of lesbian women, and 37% of bisexual men, and 26% of gay men experience IPV during their lifetime. And again, if you're coming closer to home, looking at the research, this was done by Stevenson and colleagues in 2011. They documented that IPV was experienced and perpetrated at 8%, looking at men who have sex with men. And the very same researchers did a study in 2020 in South Africa and Namibia. And the reporting of IPV, 7.3% reported being the victim of IPV from their male partners in the 12th month prior to the survey. I mean, clearly, with these figures, we can see a huge difference between the South African and the Namibian figures and the international figures. I mean, differences could be Stephenson and colleagues primarily focused on men who have sex with men, while as the international figures have focused on different identities, for example, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer. But again, the researchers argued that perhaps what was fundamental was the way questions were posed, the way the question were asked, and the way that people understood the questioning, and that this must have affected the rate this was reported. In a different, larger national survey of nearly 5.6 LGBTI Australians, the researchers found that 32.7% of the respondents reported being in a relationship where their partners were abusive. So I think from these figures, we can see that this problem is not an issue that is centralized to heterosexual relationships, as has been thought previously, but it is an alarming problem in same-sex relationships as well. Now, we need to ask ourselves, what is happening then with the silence and the lack of reporting? We know what the issues, the factors influencing silence in heterosexual relationships, but we haven't really spoken about and explored factors that are specific to same-sex sexual relationships. So, for example, if you think about cultural ideology, and we think about the ideology regarding masculinity and femininity, may discourage IPV victims from openly discussing their experiences. Now, this happens when the perceived stigma reinforces people's stereotypes that homosexual men are less masculine than heterosexual men. So therefore, if you are being victimized by your partner in a way that confirms that stereotype, that you are less stronger, you are less masculine. And additionally, that lesbian IPV is harmless. So, I mean, there's growing belief, we see it in literature, there's a belief that lesbian IPV is harmless because women are not only physically strong, because women are not physically strong and they're not dangerous. Of course, you know that is not the truth. If we look at the second factor, obviously I'm just browsing through these factors, I'm not going to focus much on them. Predominantly homophobic and heterosexist and heteronormative environments complicate or negate access to supportive services. So for an example, going to report to the police that my partner or my boyfriend or my girlfriend has physically assaulted me. How do people report that? And what is the response then from the police? If we're looking at statistics, it is difficult for people in heterosexual relationships, or women in heterosexual relationships, to report IPV to police and other authority organizations. It becomes even more difficult for LGBTQI people or queer people to report their abuse because of the layered marginalization, discrimination, and the victimization they might experience in addition to being assaulted by their partners from the police. We then look at the fear of outing. As we've said, many African countries still criminalize same-sex relationships. South Africa, as much as it has long been decriminalized, and we have a thriving, beautiful constitution, an inclusive constitution, but we do know that there is still a lot of marginalization, there's a lot of discrimination, there is a lot of abuse directed at queer individuals, LGBTQI individuals. If you think about 2021, for an example, where 20 LGBTQ individuals were killed in 1 year, probably because of their sexual identity. So if you think about the fear of outing, the threat of outing or exposing an individual's previously private sexual orientation to others, creates this unique barrier to social services for same-sex IPV victims. Now, outing can be used by perpetrators as a tool for abuse, creating a barrier to help seeking. And in circumstances where victims hide their sexual identity, their sexual expression, and in those cases, the fear of societal stigma and repercussions, the perpetrator then may exploit that fear to keep the individual locked in a destructive, in a toxic and violent relationship. We do know, I think it's public knowledge, that many individuals, due to fear of stigma and discrimination, they live the down low life. In plain society, if I can call it that, they appear as straight heterosexual men, heterosexual women. So when there's a fear then of being outed, the individual might find it difficult to leave the relationship. And I think what I found in literature was quite interesting was the misrepresentation that the abuse is mutual. So, I mean, if we're looking at this, we're thinking about the misguided beliefs that same-sex IPV perpetration is shared or equal between the two partners. And again, that causes another help-seeking barrier that is relatively unique to individuals in same-sex relationships. Now, research has shown or has indicated that service providers, they often assume that same-sex IPV is mutual. And when people have that assumption, it influences the urgency in responding. If it is mutual, then we don't have to respond immediately. They can sort it out amongst themselves. A study by Bunker indicated that one of the most pervasive and alarming myths was considering violence as a mutual conflict, particularly when the violence was occurring in a gay relationship, because the assumption is that men can fight equally. They have comparable strength. So again, that makes it difficult for these individuals, for these victims to report, because there will be a very slow response due to these misconceptions. The lack of recognition of same-sex IPV by LGBTQI communities. So if we're thinking about these power inequalities and, for example, an abuse in women's same-sex relationships, and we understand that this is partly related to this gender discourse that seems to position women as inherently non-violent. And when we think about women as inherently non-violent, this then creates for us and other people witnessing the abuse, this inability to ever imagine that violence between two women is possible, because we see women as people who are peaceful, who are not, who cannot perpetrate this kind of violence. So even that lack of recognition makes it then difficult for individuals who are locked or who are involved in these relationships to understand and to report. And finally, we're looking at the IPV stigmatization model. I'm not going to go into depth with that one. People can read up on them. But the model then seeks to describe three aspects of the individual's experience: your own internalized stigmatization, okay, the anticipated stigma, and the cultural stigma. And if you're thinking about the stigmatization, the stigma internalization, think about, the impact of one's internalized negative beliefs regarding IPV. And we see sexual minority stress coming into play with that one as well. And this really influences individuals' help-seeking behavior during their psychological distress. If we think about the anticipated stigma, now individual is moving out of themselves and they think about the anticipated stigma. What will people say? What will my family say? My colleagues say? What will the police say? What will the medical staff say when I say my boyfriend or my girlfriend, has been physically abusing me? Again, violence is mutual. It cannot occur in those relationships because those individuals are comparable in strength. And then lastly, we move on to the cultural stigma, which looks at, which promotes this notion that victims, provoke their own victimization. Again, we see that happening with individuals in heterosexual relationships. What did you do to your partner to make him or to make her or to make them angry and then abuse you? So those different, these are some of the factors. There are a multitude of other factors that prevents queer people from reporting the abuse to authorities, to their partners, and to anyone who might be able to help them. Now, I'm not going to focus a lot on that, thinking about the mental health and the health consequences of IPV. We know from research that individuals who experience IPV have increased likelihood of experiencing depression and substance abuse. We know, if we're looking at the LGBTQI community, we know that now these other problems are exacerbated by the known risk. We know that individuals who are LGBTQI, especially in oppressive environments, they have a high rate of depression, anxiety. We know that LGBTQI adolescents and teenagers are at a high or elevated risk of suicide and elevated risk of using substances such as drugs and alcohol. Now you take those already known risks that are created in part by the homophobic environment, and you couple them with consequences of IPV, you get individuals then who at a very difficult position. Emerging evidence demonstrates a very strong link again between IPV and the risk for HIV infection. We find individuals who, obviously, because of the power dynamics, the individuals might be forced into engaging in unprotected sex. And again, we see that happening a lot, with your MSM, with your transgender women as well. So those individuals become exposed to sexually transmitted infections. They become exposed to HIV, again, adding more layers of public health issues. Negative mental health outcomes for LGBTQ people, as I've mentioned, who experience IPV are amplified in the context where they receive little or limited to no social support from their families, from authorities, and again, from the legal department. So now, looking at the role of the Domestic Violence Act in promoting reporting. So they're amazing, I think it's wonderful that, it has included individuals who are in opposites and in same-sex relationships, again, extending that protection, not just for individuals who in traditional heterosexual relationships, but also protecting individuals who are in same-sex relationships or queer relationships. So I think this is wonderful. Encompassing of a wide range of behaviors of coercion, ranging from psychological and emotional abuse to physical, to sexual, to economical, to controlling, to coercion. I think this is great because then it extends umbrella to individuals who are experiencing different kinds of abuse. This were not traditionally considered domestic violence. And I think this is great, but I think the biggest question for us then to ask is, as much as this act has been amended, the institutional and the legal barriers remain firmly in place. If we think about how LGBTQI or queer people are treated by law enforcement, not just in South Africa, internationally. If you're looking at, for example, in America, there is an increased rate of imprisonment for individuals who are LGBTQI, and particularly for transgender individuals, for crimes that, that are not really feasible. So the way that these individuals are treated by law enforcement, that has not changed. And I mean, I don't see it changing anytime soon, unfortunately. So the DVAA is not making that change. The way that these individuals are treated in the healthcare sector when they seek help from hospitals, primary health clinics, that has not changed. If we're thinking about places of safety, there are places of safety predominantly for heterosexual women, but other places of safety for gay men, for bisexual men, for transgender women, transgender men, for gender non-binary individuals. Are there shelters where a transgender woman or a gender non-binary individual can confidently walk in and know that they will receive the help that they need? We don't have those structures. Those structures are not in place. And and again, even the structures that are currently in place, they are not LGBTQI friendly. Our police stations are not LGBTQI friendly. Our clinics and hospital and our healthcare staff, they're not LGBTQI friendly. We know that from practice. We know that from research. So what can the DVAA do then? Yes, it is inclusive. Yes, it covers a lot of people, but we still have the problem in terms of reporting. Before the case can get to court, we still have the problem in terms of how do people get to a point where they are confident enough to report. When they have worked through the control issues in the relationship, they need to start thinking about working through the added victimization and discrimination and ridicule they will experience from external structures. So I think this is something that we need to think about, because really, in my perspective, the DVAA cannot work in silo. It cannot work as an individual act. It has to be integrated. These different departments have to come to the table and work together in promoting reporting, because through reporting can people be protected. So what can we do? Are there any interventions that you can put into place? Again, very general and non-specific. Public education for one. If you go to a hospital, if you see TV commercials that are looking at gender-based violence, it's always framed from a heteronormative perspective. It's always about heterosexual individuals. We hardly see public media in the television, in hospitals. We hardly see posters about two gay guys, or two lesbian women, or transgender individuals. So we need more of the public education on IPV to say IPV actually, happens in same-sex relationships. It's not something that is only focused or concentrated in heterosexual relationships. Specific training on assessing and responding to LGB. So bringing in your police men and your peace officers, because those people become the first line of defense. They become the first contact that individuals will have when they're trying to report this crime. bringing those people, bringing those paramedics, bringing the social workers, bringing the primary healthcare personnel. So how to accurately detect? Number one, detecting means not assuming that IPV in queer relationships is a mutual act. I think we need to dispel of this myth, number one. But also, for me, very importantly, how then to compassionately respond to victims of IPV who identify as LGBTQI+. Again, this can be grouped together with general education regarding homophobia in society, regarding heterosexism, heteronormativity. So you can clump that together. The development of appropriate response protocols for law enforcement professionals. We're looking at police officers, we're looking at police officers, we're looking at prosecutors, we're looking at magistrates, because believe it or not, homophobia, we see it happening in society, we see it happening inside the courtroom. So if it is happening inside the courtroom, how can we expect victims to feel more empowered to take their cases to that level? So appropriate response protocols, but again, combined with compassionately responding to victims. And at an individual level, the development of individualized treatment plans. This must include safety plans. That's where the NGOs come in. That's where the Department of Social Development come in. Are there enough safety, places of safety that a gay man can run to, that a bush lesbian can run to, that a transgender woman or transgender man or a gender non-binary person can run to? Do we have those places of safety? If we say they must remove themselves from the abusive relationship and they don't have the financial resources or means to be independent and they need safety, where are they going to go? Some of them can't go back to their families because their families are very homophobic. They want nothing to do with them. They can't go to churches because churches, I'm sorry to say, some of the churches are on a witch hunt. To hunt down LGBTQI people because they are seen as a problem in society, as decaying the morals of society. So they can't run to their families, they can't run to the church. Where can they run to if there are no places of safety? So I think those are the conversations as psychologists, as advocates, that we need to be having in platforms like this, in other platforms, in our practices, in the hospital, in correctional facilities where I work. We all need to have these conversations, because without us changing the status quo, we are going to have queer people locked in abusive, toxic relationships. And what happens at the end of the line? People commit suicide. What happens at the end of the line? People lead very destructive lifestyles. What happens at the end of the line? They get murdered by their own partners. We cannot overlook those possibilities. And with that, thank you very much. These are my references, and I'm looking forward to engaging with the audience with the Q&A session. Thank you very much, Angeline.
And Kanyisa, thank you so much for sharing your work with us and your insights. I think you've just highlighted so many salient issues. For example, the cultural and the social and political ideologies that frame how we construct violence, how we respond to violence, and then ultimately that shapes the kinds of legislations that we put into effect. And I think you've also done a really great job in terms of foregrounding the heterosexual bias that frames just violence and GBV in our country, but also just across the globe, and how this sets up barriers in terms of talking about violence within same-sex relationships, accessing support, and how there's a need for, I think, a lot of activism and advocacy, psychoeducation around it, but just a lot of tangible support as well. For example, the important question of, is there enough places of safety for queer persons, for example? So thank you so much. And I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions and comments. So this brings us to the last segment, and probably the most exciting segment as well, because we get to talk with each other. It's my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague Pierre Broad. Pierre is a clinical psychologist. He's the acting director of the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender at the University of Pretoria. He is also an executive member of the SGD division of SISA and a board member of the Professional Association of Transgender Health in South Africa. Pierre has worked in HIV since the mid-1980s and at the center since 2001. His interests and work include sexualities, gender, human rights, stigma, governance, leadership, accountability, transformation, diversity, and social justice. And with that, Pierre, I hand over to you, and Pierre will facilitate the next session. Thank you so much, Pierre.
Thank you, Angeline. This is the moment when you regret sharing your bio sketch, which says you started working in HIV in the middle 1980s, because you've outed yourself as a very ancient person. I'd like to thank all the speakers. We've got a really rich array of inputs this evening, and I think it's given us an opportunity to have a really interesting discussion. Before I go to the comments and or questions from Emerentia, Kamogelo, and I think Antrizia, apologies if I mispronounced your name, you made a comment about a pride shelter in Cape Town. I wanted to raise something firstly for you, Lisa, as a point of clarity, and then maybe some comment from Nkateko and Nkanyiso about the practice of psychologists, particularly perhaps those in private practice settings, which I suspect constitutes many of the people in the audience. But I do note, Lisa, your challenge in a sense that you threw out to us in the session this evening about more psychologists being involved in shelters. It did strike me that that would be really complex and difficult work, and with a very traumatized and troubled subset of the psychological population. But in relation to perhaps the role that we might play as psychologists in private practice, Lisa, could I first ask you, just on a point of clarity, in my reading in preparation for this evening, understood that the mandatory reporting may have applied only to certain vulnerable populations, like people with disabilities, with young people and older persons. But was I correct in reading or hearing you that we have a duty to report any form of domestic violence if it is reported to us, for example, in a therapeutic session? And I'm thinking here about how quite wide the definition of domestic violence has become. So Section 1 of the Act defines it as physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, verbal, or psychological abuse, economic abuse, intimidation, harassment, or sexual harassment. And other categories have been inserted into the definition of domestic violence, including spiritual abuse, elder abuse, exposing a child to domestic violence, coercive behavior, controlling behavior, and entry into a victim's workplace or study or place of study without consent. So I'm thinking in a sort of perhaps a private practice setting, would we, if a client reported any of these kinds of acts in their experience in a kind of exploratory way, as sort of sounding out what the options were, to what extent are we immediately required to report that? And then I'll go to the psychologist for their thoughts about the clinical implications of that. So Lisa, firstly for you.
I mean, I'm sorry if I gave you that impression. It is only people with disabilities. It is only people with disabilities, children and older persons. There was an attempt in the first draft of the amendment to introduce a mandatory reporting requirement across the board, but that was very strong. It was very strongly opposed by a number of us. And I even think that extending a mandatory reporting requirement to certain disabilities can also be objected to, because a mandatory reporting requirement does take away people's agency from them and make them somewhat on a par with children, the one group of people whose agency we are allowed to remove. So,
Yes.
you know, obviously when somebody has a psychiatric difficulty, or they have Alzheimer's or some other reason, then you may override their consent. But a situation where anybody could run off and report that they think you're in a domestic violence situation is very undesirable, especially if you haven't discussed it with the individual first. You could be putting them at risk for the police
Yes.
to suddenly arrive. So no, it was quite strongly opposed by some of us. So it was removed.
That's reassuring to hear.
Yeah.
And you know, as an aside, Lisa, you probably know that I think a separate piece of legislation now makes it mandatory for students, women students in tertiary settings, if they report, if they, for example, I work at the University of Pretoria, if a student reports a rape or a sexual assault, we are obliged to report that to the police as well. And that struck me as an interesting debate also around the question of agency, and would that deter young women from coming to university authorities to report a rape, for example? Do you have
I do
thoughts
think
on?
so. I do. And I mean, some of the work that I've done on where we have the data that looks at rape in tertiary settings suggests that it's probably the bulk of it is between people who are known to one another, who have been drinking and socializing beforehand. Nothing wrong with that. You are not in any way to blame. However, those are the cases that do the absolutely worst in the criminal justice system. There is good reason why you would not want to send someone there, because they will get no justice, no happiness, no satisfaction. A university process that uses a different burden of proof, that is designed not to engage, I think, in aggressive adversarial cross-examination, is a very much better one. So yeah, I would also strongly disagree with taking people's agency away and also pushing them into processes that are not, you know, you would only justify that if there was some massive gain to be made, and even then that's dodgy. There's no benefit. There really isn't. Not that I can see, not unless there's a massive change in the criminal justice system. And to add to that, the research I've been doing recently would suggest that with the budget cuts in the department and the shortage of staff, what's happened is it's pushed prosecutors, in order to meet their performance targets, to pick the best cases, the ones that are most likely to result in convictions. So those cases will never even get put down for trial.
Yes, and certainly my experience as sitting on gender panels where there are inquiries about an allegation of assault or sexual impropriety, quite often they occur in that sort of grey, messy space of dating, hanging out, people spending time together, where the sort of clarity of wrongdoing is quite difficult to tease out. So it's an interesting intervention which sort of formulates and conceives of young women as a particular category of vulnerability. And I think there are philosophical and other, as you say, practical challenges involved in that too. Just if I could go to Nkateko and Nkanyiso, your thoughts about mandatory reporting. I mean, we've clarified that it's only in the case of certain vulnerable populations, but I'm thinking if your primary client reports of knowing somebody else that might be in a domestic violence situation, how do you feel about the idea that we might be obliged to take that further to the authorities? For example, in relation to the boundaries we might want to set in clinical practice, ideas around agency, and the extent to which we might be stepping into a space of needing to act in ways that often we don't usually do as psychologists. Nkateko, can I go to you first?
Sure. I'm just even thinking of the, legislation that speaks to and very strongly speaking to expose a child to domestic violence
Yes.
And by virtue of that, where a child is exposed to domestic violence, by virtue, then you are mandated to then expose the, whoever is a victim in that role in a child. So the child, yes, will be the primary victim. You will be intervening or reporting on their behalf, but also the other partner in the relationship that is on the receiving end of the violence. So that also puts, and I made that case study where, the father has been quite abusive and the mother wanted the children to come. And I said, no, I need to see you because we need to, as a couple, because we need to rehabilitate your husband. And should that fail, should that intervention fail, then it means it's on my onus because I'm seeing the damage that is happening and continuously where things are not changing. So already it's a mandate that obliges me to even report the violence towards or the abuse towards the mother. So I think it's sticky. Or tricky at least, because the same people that will need to give us permission, for this child that is in an abusive or exposed to violence or domestic violence, it might even be the parents in terms of maybe going to courts, filling up certain forms and all of that. So it becomes tricky in terms of, and that is why I highlighted practicality, because that then I wondered about how practical is this process then, and mainly because the people who can approach the courts or who we need to report to, it's the South African Police Services and the social workers. So it's not like we are reporting to ourselves. If we were reporting to ourselves, maybe there might have been certain efficiencies or certain ways in which we are able to move, to make sure that there is intervention on behalf of this child whom the parents might be reluctant.
Thanks, Nkateko. And Kaniso, what are your thoughts?
I really agree with what my colleagues have said. It's a very tricky situation, Pierre. In that if there's mandatory reporting, we're thinking about a child, a person living with a disability, maybe an elderly person, it is mandated that we need to report that. I mean, it doesn't make it any easier, but it's mandated. I think when we get into the gray areas of removing those special well, not special, but those kind of categories, and we're thinking about people that we are seeing, they are sitting in front of us, and they are victims of violence. What do we do with those individuals? And even considering our mandatory reporting, we're thinking about the risk-benefits kind of debate. When we do report that, the father is abusing the mom and the child is exposed to that violence, what happens when the case is out of our hands? What happens if, the case is, does not get attention in the police station and the child now has to return back to the very same environment? The mom has to return to the very same environment. What happens to their safety? So it's I mean, on one side we are required by the law to report, which again is looking at the well-being of the clients that we're working with. But on the other side, we need to think about the long-term benefits. We know the criminal justice system is not efficient in our country. It's not efficient in many countries. That's quite for sure. Social development is not efficient in our countries. They're doing the best they can, but their processes are not so efficient. So, where do we locate ourselves? We report, we live it, we live the message through this very long, tedious process. What happens in between the reporting and the case being sorted? Are they safe? Will they continue being safe? Will they be removed from this environment to a safer environment? So it's a bit tricky. That's my
Thanks, Nkaniso. Yeah, I think you've both highlighted some really important challenges there. I suspect that some of these changes to the law express frustrations from gender activists, violence activists, also from lawmakers about trying to sort of increase reporting. But I suppose ultimately we want to address the other end of the gender violence or the violence stream, which is what causes it in the first place. And I suppose there are debates about where we need to be putting most of our energies and efforts. Lisa, very briefly, before we start to wrap up, a question from Emerentia saying that they had reported abuse to social workers, but they seem to only be able to do so much. Do you foresee the amendments changing their powers and abilities, or increasing the chances of prosecutions?
I'm assuming that's in relation to children, and not
Yes.
adults.
Yeah, let's focus on children.
I am personally very concerned when I see what is happening to the Department of Social Development's budgets and the implications of what that means for NGOs who provide a big portion of child protection, the statutory services, and the state. So it is deeply concerning, and I don't think they're going to be able to, because they're already not managing. You know, some of the docket research we've done, it's not unusual to find a child being brought in showing signs of chronic abuse. The kind of anal scarring you see from ongoing anal rape. You don't even know who the child is living with. They can't figure out who the perpetrator is, and that's the end of the case. That child hasn't been reported. That child should have been identified as a child in need of care, who's neglected. Nothing happened. So yeah, I think what Nkateko was saying about overburdened systems that aren't coping, you have to think very carefully before you give them anything more to do. Otherwise, they just become another source of abuse.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. I feel like you've been in the trenches for so long. I wonder how you keep your spirit up in doing this work. But thanks for that reflection. To end on a slightly more positive note, just to acknowledge Anna Trezia's comment about the Pride Shelter in Cape Town, offering support and shelter to queer individuals. And also, Kamohelo, I didn't get to your comment question, but you did say that there was value in working with men around mental health and able to help them work through issues and challenge cultural norms which might have precipitated violence. So thank you for that input. Thank you, everybody, for your inputs. Angeline, perhaps you want to wrap up briefly, and please remember to do the evaluation form, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. Huge thanks to our presenters, Lisa and Kanyiso and Nkateko, and of course, most importantly, to all of you as well who have joined us this evening. I think I'm sure you all would agree with me. It's been a most insightful webinar. It raises so many important questions in terms of our role. I think for me, what really makes me think is, you know, in terms of whether, like, in extending the kinds of support that we have and responses, whether it also, though, highlights the state's over-reliance on NGOs to deal with issues, to turn to communities, etc., to support, and in fact, deviates from the state's obligations to deal with very structural cultural ideologies that underpin the perpetration of violence and that sees its continuation as well. But I think in all our spaces, what this webinar has done is perhaps get us to reflect on our own practices and in what ways can we become advocates where we encourage non-judgmental ways in terms of how we work with the persons who have experienced violence, but also just in terms of the spaces that we, whether it is in an institution, like a higher education institution, where it's fraught with lots of reports of violence and sexual violence, but also lots of challenges. So it's very much a microcosm of what we see out in society. In what ways do we advocate? In what ways do we become activists as well in our support of women and children and other groups who have experienced violence? So thank you all so much. Please do not forget to click on the link to complete the CPD attendance register. You will receive 2 general CPD points for this. So with that, thank you all. Stay safe and have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.